Tonight we're going to
Sermon
be talking
14,
about
Jacob
getting
takes
a
a
wife.
wife.
You may remember that Abraham told his servant not to get a wife from the Canaanites, but rather to go back to the land of Haran and there to get a wife for Isaac. And we see that Isaac wanted to do the same for Jacob from the encouragement that he received from Rebekah, his wife. But of course, Rebekah had a different reason for wanting Jacob to go back to Haran and to get a wife. Not only did she want him to get a wife, but she was afraid that because they had deceived her oldest son, Esau, that Esau might want to take vengeance and do harm to her youngest son, Jacob. And so she convinced Isaac to send Jacob back to Haran. And Isaac called Jacob, and he blessed him, and he charged him. He said unto Jacob, I do not want you to take a wife of the daughters of Canaan, but I want you to go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father, and to take a wife from the daughters of Laban. And so Jacob, doing as his father wished, made his preparations to go to Haran and to get a wife. Also in that discussion that Isaac had with Jacob, he told him that God would be with him, that he would bless him, he would make him fruitful, that he would multiply him, and that he would be a blessing just like Abraham had been, and that he would be a stranger in the land, and that God would give that land to his children. Now this was what had been said to Abraham and also had been said to Isaac. Abraham was 99 years old when God changed his name and re-emphasized the promises that he had made to him in Genesis the 17th chapter. And he made a covenant with Abraham and told Abraham, I will multiply thee exceedingly. And he said that I'll make thy name great. And he said that I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make many nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. He said, I'll establish my kingdom between me and thee and between thy seed. And of course, it had been promised to Isaac, and now it was being promised to Jacob that God would indeed bless them, and that their children would be multiplied as the sand on the seashore and as the stars of heaven. So Jacob now is making his preparation to go to the land of Haran and there to seek a wife. And so Isaac encourages him to do so. And of course Rebekah wants him to do that because she is afraid of what Esau might do to him. So Jacob leaves his mother and father and his brother and makes his journey into the land of Haran. And of course, as he is doing this back home, Esau is angry with what his mother has done and the fact that his father has blessed Jacob. And Esau goes out and takes 2 additional wives, daughters of Ishmael, and he did so in order to anger his parents. So Jacob is on his journey to Haran. He stops at a little place called Luz for the night. He puts some stones up for a pillow, makes his bed, and he goes to sleep. And as he is sleeping, he dreams that he sees a ladder that extends from earth to heaven. And at the top of this ladder, he sees God. And God is saying to him that I am going to bless thee, that I'm going to give thee the land whereon you are lying, that you're going to be a stranger in this land, and I will give this land to you and to your seeds. He says that you're going to be a blessing, and in thee shall many families of the earth be blessed. When Jacob awoke from the dream, he thought to himself, this must be the house of God. This must be where God is. This must be the gateway to heaven. And there he took the stone that he had used as his pillow. He poured oil on it. And he made a promise to God that if you will bring me back safely from the land of Haran, that if you will give me the bread that I need to eat and the raiment that I need to put on and bring me back peaceably to my father and to my father's house, he said, then the Lord will be my God. And he said that, and not only that, I will give a tenth of all that I possess unto thee. I will give a tenth, and we sometimes refer to that as tithing, a tenth of that which one possesses. So God made a covenant there, and Jacob made a promise to God, and God made the covenant with Jacob that he would bless him, that he would keep him whither he would go, and he would bring him again into the land, and that he would not leave him, and he would be with him until he had done everything that he had promised. So Jacob comes into the land of Haran, and the Bible tells us that he goes to the well there in Haran because this would be the place that the people would come out, and he would be able to see the people in the area, and he would be able to find where his family was living there in that country. And as he approached the well, he noticed that there were many flocks around the well, and the shepherds had them basically bedded down there. And there was a stone upon the well, and he wanted to know what they were waiting for, and they said that it was customary that they would wait till all the flocks gathered, then the men would remove the stone and they would water the flocks. And I'm sure this was done for protection, to keep people from throwing things into the well, because their source of water was very precious to them. But as he was speaking, Rachel was coming to the well with her father's flocks to water them. And when she got to the well, Jacob greeted her, introduced himself, he kissed her in his greeting, and as we might say, he fell in love at first sight. He fell in love with his cousin Rachel. He removed the stone and he watered the flocks there of Laban, and he told her everything about him, and I'm sure he included the fact that he was there to find a wife and the things that had been going on in their life. She left and went to Laban and told him that Jacob was there, and Laban came out to meet Jacob, and they did their greetings, and he invited him to his house and went in basically and entertained him, as had been the case with Isaac his father. And after being there a little while, Laban wants to know, basically, what can I pay you, or what can I give you? I don't want you to work for me for nothing. What would be your wages? And of course, the Bible says that Jacob loved Rachel. She was a beautiful woman. And Jacob told Laban that I will work for you for 7 years for your daughter Rachel. We might say that he got his wife on credit, that he was willing to work out payments. And he said, I'll be there for 7 years and I'll work. And Laban said, I would rather give her to you for a wife rather than to give her to someone else. In other words, you are family. So the agreement was made based upon what Jacob had said, that I will work for her for 7 years. And Jacob, of course, loved Rachel. The Bible says that the time passed. It was but a few days because of the love that he has for Rachel. But Laban tricked Jacob. There was a custom in his land that the oldest child was to be married before the younger child. And Laban had another daughter by the name of Leah. And she was a fair woman to look upon. She was the oldest daughter. And his plan was to trick Jacob and to give Jacob Leah when it came time to pay up. And that's exactly what he did. They had the wedding feast. The guests were invited in, and when it came time to, the customary to present the bride to her husband, along with many of the gifts I'm sure that the guests brought, Laban gave his daughter a handmaid, and he gave this handmaid Zilpah to his daughter, and then he gave the daughter to Jacob. And the Bible says that Jacob went in unto her, and he wasn't aware that it wasn't the one that he had worked 7 years for. And the next morning he realized that it was Leah and not Rachel, and he was angry. He was angry with with Laban rather, because Laban had deceived him. And it was then that Laban explained the tradition, the custom that they had, and that is, it wasn't right to allow the younger daughter to marry before the older daughter. Of course, he hadn't bothered to explain this to Jacob in the beginning, so he had him to work for 7 years, and he gave him his oldest daughter, and Jacob was angry, and in order to pacify his anger, Laban basically said, "Will you give my daughter Leah her week," as we would call honeymoon, "give her week, and then after that week is up, then I'll give you Rachel as, you can have her as wife, but you'll have to work another 7 years." And of course, Jacob loved Rachel as he did, and he agreed to that, and for 14 years total he worked for his two wives, Leah and Rachel. Many have questioned, as to why God would allow man to have more than one wife, but you have to remember that what God allowed and what God did not allow depends most of the time upon the will of man. There were many things that man did that God did not approve of. You may remember that Jesus said in his discussion concerning marriage, that from the beginning it was not so in regards to what Moses had allowed under the law of Moses as far as divorce was concerned. And he said from the beginning it was not so. In the book of Genesis, when we read about God's plan, God said to Adam, to take this woman, that she is the bone of your bone, and she's flesh of your flesh, and they twain shall be one flesh. So the plan of God was basically to be one woman and one man, but it was the desire of man to have more than one wife. And of course, Jacob was not the first man to have more than one wife. There were many before him, and there would be many that would come after him that would have more than one wife. The Bible says that King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, I can't imagine how any man would want 700 wives, but even greater than that is having 700 mother-in-laws to put up with. But he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and people say, why did God allow it? Because God did not interfere with the will of man, with man's decision, but rather God worked his plan through man who had his fallacies. Just in the case of Jacob here, it wasn't God's plan that Jacob was to deceive his brother Esau. It wasn't in God's plan that Rebekah would help Jacob in that deception and getting the blessing. But it is God's plan in working out his plan through the ones that would be in the position to receive those blessings. So Jacob worked for 14 years for his two wives. And then the family began. That is, Jacob began to father children. And because God saw that Leah was loved less, that's what the word hated there means. It means that she was loved less than Rachel. That God closed up the womb of Rachel and she did not give birth to children. And of course this bothered her a lot. And Leah was able to give birth to children. The Bible tells us that Leah gave birth to 4 sons unto Jacob. And Rachel, seeing that God had allowed her sister to give birth to children, and she not having any, she came up with this plan that she said, I will give my handmaid to my husband, and he can have children from my handmaid. And of course, this goes back to a flashback to what Sarah had done with Abraham. in trying to help out the promise of God when God said, you know, in your seed are all the nations of the earth going to be blessed, and I'm going to multiply your seed. And Sarah saw that Abraham was an old man, she was an old woman, and they had no children. And she said, I'll just give you my handmaid, and you can raise up children from her, trying to help God out. So this wasn't a new thing. And so Rachel said, I'll just give Bilhah, my handmaid, to Jacob, and he can have sons or daughters from my handmaid. And of course there were two sons that were born, Simeon and Levi. And there were two sons rather that were born, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, and Reuben to Leah. And then of course she wanted to have sons, and she could not have those sons. So Bilhah had two sons for Jacob. And Rachel felt like that she was the victor then. She said, you know, I've wrestled with my sister and I won. But of course the score was 4-2. The score was 4-2. We have what's taking place here, the beginning, as we would say, the 12 tribes of Israel. This is where the foundation for dividing God's people in the promised land would come from. And we see the background in which this was established, that you have two sisters here that are going at each other because they're both in love with the same man, and they're trying to win his affection by giving him children. And if they can't produce those children themselves, they said, well, I'll just give my handmaid, and she can produce the children. And of course Leah has 4, and now Rachel, through her handmaid Bilhah, has 2. And she said, I've wrestled with my sister and I've won. Well, not to be outdone, Leah says, well, I've got a handmaid, and I'll give her to Jacob. And she did. And Jacob went in unto the handmaid of Leah, and she bare children, the first one being Gad. And Leah rejoiced because of that. You know, she said, a troop is coming. Then the second was Asher. And she said, I've been blessed, and now my husband will love me because I've given him so many children. So you see the battle that's going on. Reuben goes out one day, the oldest of Leah, and he goes out into the wheat fields there. He's working out in the fields, and he finds some mandrakes. Mandrakes were thought to have fertility elements in them. That is, if you eat the mandrakes, you can have children. Rachel heard that Reuben had found the mandrakes, and she goes to her sister Leah and says, you know, I want the mandrakes. I don't have any children. I'm barren here. I want the mandrakes. And they bargain back and forth, and Leah basically says to Rachel, you know, you've taken my husband, now you want to take my mandrakes. You know, you want my fertility drug, if you please. And she bargained with her and said, well, what would it take? And Leah said, if you'll just have Jacob come and be with me. You know, if you just send Jacob to my house. And they agree, and Leah gives Rachel the mandrakes. And Leah runs out to meet Jacob as he's coming home from the fields to work. And she says, you're coming to my house tonight, you're sleeping with me. You know, I've hired you. I've hired you. I've bought you. You're mine. You're coming home with me. And so he goes home with her. And she conceives and gives birth to 3 more children. You know, this is, I'm sure, very upsetting to Rachel, because she is able to give birth to 3 more children, Issachar and Zebulun, and she had a daughter named Dinah. And so Rachel is thinking about all of this, and the Bible says that God remembers Rachel. He remembers her. See, he had closed her womb because Leah was loveless, but God remembers Rachel, and he opens her womb, and she conceives, and she has a son, and his name is Joseph. Now, Joseph will play a very important role in the Bible. But after she gave birth to Joseph, she said, God shall add to me another son. Now I want you to remember that statement, that this is what Rachel had said, that God had blessed her, and she said, God will add to me another son. Jacob has worked now for many years for Laban, and God has blessed Laban because Jacob is there. His flocks are multiplying. He is a much wealthier man than he was when Jacob came to live with him. And Jacob says to Laban, basically, I want to leave and I want to go back to my father's house. I want to take my wives and I want to take my children. You know, he had 2 wives, 2 handmaids, and a total of 12 children at this time. And he said, I want to return back to the land of Canaan, to my father's house. And Laban didn't want him to go. He didn't want him to go because he knew that he was being blessed, and they worked out a deal, and Jacob said, I'll continue to work for you on this condition. I'll go in amongst the flocks, and all the animals that are spotted or streaked or solid brown, I'll take those as my payment. And keep in mind that Jacob had not been receiving any pay. He'd just been working for his father-in-law. And he said, I'll take these as my payment. And Laban agreed to it, and he went in and he separated all the animals that were spotted and had blemishes and those that were brown, and he placed them about 3 days' journey from Laban's flocks. He went out and he took some limbs off of different trees, and he peeled them back and he made streaks in them. He put these where the animals would feed and where they would water. He made them spotted, he made them speckled, and as the animals came to eat and to drink, they conceived, and they brought forth lambs and sheep and goats that were speckled and spotted. And Laban didn't like that because Jacob was multiplying, his flocks were multiplying in number, and Laban changed it, and every time he had changed it, when the flocks were more in number and speckled and spotted one, Laban say, well, I want the speckled and spotted ones, I want you to have the solid ones. And then the sheep, the flocks would begin to grow, and there would be more in number of the solid ones, and Laban would change it again, and he would say, I want the solid ones. And Jacob would say, okay, and he'd go back to taking the speckled and the spotted. But God was blessing Jacob. And it came to the point to where the sons of Laban said, basically, Jacob has stolen our father's riches. That he's taken away all that was our father's. Because they could see that Jacob was being blessed and his flocks were growing. And so because of the controversy that was going on, Jacob called in his wives and he tells them, it's time to leave. It's time to go back to the land of Canaan. And of course, Leah and Rachel were able to witness with their own eyes that Jacob was becoming very wealthy. His wealth was growing and that of Laban was shrinking. And they said, we have no inheritance among our fathers, so we're going to go with you. But Jacob was afraid of his father-in-law, and so he snuck away. He stole away in the night. And he got a 3 days journey from Laban, and he found out that he was gone, and he pursued after him with his servants. And he came up on him. But the night before he came up on Jacob, God appeared to Laban in a dream, and he warned Laban. He said, do not speak good or evil to Jacob. You be careful what you do. And Laban became afraid. And I want to emphasize here that Laban was not a man of God. He was an idolater. He was a person that did not serve the God that Jacob served. But he was an idolater. But he feared because of the dream that he had. And he came to Jacob and he wanted to know why he had taken away his children, why he had taken away all that was his, and why he stole his gods. Jacob was unaware that Rachel had gone and taken the idols of Laban and had stolen them from her father's house and had them in her possession. But Jacob didn't know that. And Jacob says to Laban, you search among all of my things, and if you find anything, that is yours, the person that you fight it with, let's put them to death. Let's kill them. He was unaware that the woman that he loved more than anything in the world had stolen those idols from her own father. And she had them in her possession. And so Laban made a search throughout all the tents, and he could not find anything. And he had went to everyone's tent, and he came to Rachel's last of all, and she was sitting there upon the riding gear of the camel, and she had the idols up under her. And she told her father, you're going to have to excuse me because the time of the month for women is upon me, and I don't want to get up. I'll be embarrassed, is what she's saying. So her father allowed her to remain seated, and of course she had concealed the idols. And then Jacob became angry. And he said to Laban, I have served thee all of these years, 20 years, and I have not wronged thee in anything. You know, when you said one thing, I did that. When you said another thing, I changed my mind and went to that. And he said, you have changed my wages these 10 times, and now you accuse me of stealing your gods. And Laban said to Jacob, all of these people, these children, these are my daughters, these are my children, these are my possessions. You know, he was angry too. He was going to lose, as we would say, the goose that laid the golden egg. And he didn't want to give that up. He had 20 years of free labor, and he didn't want to lose that. But God had told him, and had told him in a dream, that he was not to do anything to Jacob. That he was not to do anything. So he changed, and he decided that it would be better to send Jacob on his way, to bless him and to bless his children, and allow them to leave the land of Haran and to go back into the land of Canaan, because that's what God had told him to do. You may remember back when Abraham was dwelling in the land of Canaan, God said, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And God took Abraham out of the land of Haran, and he placed him in the land of Canaan, and he sojourned all his life. He did that for Isaac. Isaac was in the land of promise, but never owned the land. And he would do that with Jacob. That Jacob would now return back to the land in which God had said to Jacob when he saw that ladder that reached from earth to heaven. And God said to him in a dream, this land whereon thou liest will be thy land, and it will be the land of thy children. And he said to Jacob that in thee all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And you see, we look forward in the Bible to that time when Jesus would come, give his life on the cross, so that the fulfillment of that promise would come to fruition. And that is that all mankind through Jesus Christ might be blessed. If you're here tonight to respond to the invitation, we want to give you that opportunity to do so while we stand and while we sing.